September 11th, 1297. To the English crown, the Scots were not a nation, they were a collection of broken rebels. King Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, had already conquered Wales, crushed the Scottish nobility at Dunbar, and stolen the Stone of Destiny. He believed the war was over. But while the lords were surrendering their castles, the gilded truth was festering in the Highlands. Two men, a disgraced younger son of a knight named William Wallace, and a northern rebel named Andrew Moray, were about to rewrite the rules of medieval warfare. They didn't have heavy cavalry. They didn't have thousands of longbows. They had a wooden bridge and a plan that would humiliate the greatest military power in Europe. This is the story of how 6,000 commoners turned a river into a graveyard for 20,000 professional soldiers. To understand Stirling, you have to understand the humiliation that preceded it. In 1296, Edward I invaded with a brutality that shocked the medieval world. At Berwick, he slaughtered thousands of civilians to send a message. By the time he reached Elgin, the Scottish King John Baliol had been stripped of his royal tabard and sent to the Tower of London. Edward installed English tax collectors and sheriffs across the land. The Scottish nobility, terrified of losing their lucrative estates in England, knelt. But the communitas, the common people, did not. Wallace and Moray didn't lead an army of blue-blooded knights. They led an army of the dispossessed. They were outnumbered, out-armored, and outfunded. But they held the one thing Edward's professionals lacked: the home ground. They knew that in the marshy bogs of the north, a knight's horse is just a very expensive anchor. Stirling was the gateway to the north. If you controlled the bridge, you controlled the kingdom. To the south, the English commanders, John de Warenne, the Earl of Surrey, and the hated treasurer, Hugh de Cressingham, arrived with the finest heavy cavalry in Christendom. 2,000 knights and 18,000 infantry. They looked across the river and saw the Scots gathered on the heights of the Abbey Craig. Wallace and Moray sat and watched. They didn't charge. They didn't retreat. They waited for the English to make the one mistake that aristocratic ego always produces: the belief that peasants cannot fight. The English saw a rabble. Wallace saw a bottleneck. The stage was set for the most lopsided massacre in British history. Up next, the ego of kings. We reveal the fatal argument between the English commanders that led 5,000 men into a watery grave. To understand why 5,000 men marched to their deaths, you have to understand the man who sent them: Hugh de Cressingham. He wasn't a soldier, he was a treasurer. To the Scots, he was the face of English greed. To the English army, he was the man holding the purse strings. The Earl of Surrey, a battle-hardened veteran, knew the bridge was a death trap. He had a plan: send a flanking force to a nearby ford to take the Scots from behind. But Cressingham was worried about the daily burn rate of the king's gold. Every day the army sat idle was a day the treasury bled. Cressingham famously barked, "There is no use in drawing out this war and wasting the king's treasure. Let us cross and do our duty." Surrey, aging and perhaps weary of the king's taxman, relented. He ignored the tactical reality of the narrow wooden bridge, a bridge so slim that only 2 horsemen could cross abreast. Against every rule of military logic, the heavy cavalry began to clatter across the wood. 2 by 2, methodically. Right into a marshy loop of the river Forth, where there was no room to turn a horse, let alone charge a line. On the heights of the Abbey Craig, William Wallace and Andrew Moray did the impossible. They held their breath. For hours, the Scots watched. They watched as 100 knights crossed. Then 500. Then 2,000 infantry. The Scottish captains, terrified of the growing force on their side of the river, begged for the order to charge. Wallace refused. He was waiting for the tipping point. If he attacked too early, the English would simply retreat across the bridge. If he attacked too late, they would have enough numbers to form a defensive line. This required a level of psychological discipline never before seen in a peasant army. Wallace and Moray were waiting for exactly enough English to cross, so that the bridge became a cork in a bottle. They waited until the vanguard, roughly 5,000 men, including the cream of the English cavalry, was trapped in the bend of the river. The water was deep behind them. The mud was soft beneath them. and the Scots were above them. Coming up next, the slaughter in the mud. We witness the charge of the Chilterns and the gruesome fate of the man who started it all. The signal was given. The Scots didn't just charge, they sprinted with the desperation of men who knew there was no retreat. Their objective wasn't just to engage the English, it was to sever the bridge. The Scottish spearmen moved in schiltrons, dense hedgehog-like formations of 12-foot pikes. They struck the English vanguard like a tidal wave. Because the English were boxed into a tight loop of the river, they had nowhere to go. The English heavy cavalry, the most feared weapon in the medieval world, found themselves in a nightmare. The ground was soft and marshy. Their horses couldn't gallop, and their lances were useless at close range. The Scots pushed. They didn't aim for the riders. They gutted the horses. Knights in 50 pounds of steel armor were toppled into the mud, unable to rise, and were systematically finished off with daggers through their visors. While the vanguard was being slaughtered, the bridge became a scene of pure horror. The Earl of Surrey watched from the south bank as his best men were cut down. He tried to send reinforcements, but the narrow wooden path was blocked by retreating survivors. According to some chronicles, the bridge actually collapsed under the weight of the panic. Whether it broke or was simply blocked by the dead, the result was the same. The 5,000 men on the north side were abandoned. They were trapped against the deep, cold waters of the Forth. Many attempted to swim in full plate armor. They didn't stand a chance. They sank like stones. Among the fallen was the man who had demanded the crossing, Hugh de Cressingham. The Scots' hatred for him was so profound that death was not enough. The gilded truth of Stirling Bridge is recorded in the Lennocost Chronicle. The Scots flayed his body while it was still warm. They divided his skin into small pieces as trophies of their liberation. William Wallace himself reportedly took a strip of Cressingham's skin to make a baldric, a sword belt. It was a visceral, bloody message to King Edward. Your tax collectors will no longer skin Scotland. Scotland has skinned your tax collector. Coming up next, the Gilded Verdict. The loss of Andrew Moray, and how Stirling Bridge set the stage for the 700-year struggle for independence. The English army was in full retreat, fleeing all the way back to Baruch in a state of total collapse. Scotland was, for the first time in years, free of the occupier. But in the heart of the victory lay a fatal wound. History remembers the name Wallace, but the gilded truth is that Stirling Bridge was a joint masterpiece. Andrew Moray, the tactical genius of the North, had been severely injured in the thick of the fight. While Wallace was being knighted and named Guardian of Scotland, his shadow, the man who provided the strategic balance to Wallace's raw fury, was fading. Moray would die of his wounds weeks later. With him went the cool-headed diplomacy and northern support that the rebellion desperately needed. Wallace was now alone at the helm of a nation that the most powerful king in Europe was now determined to erase. Stirling Bridge was a humiliation that Edward I could not ignore. He didn't just want to win. He wanted to make an example of the man who had skinned his treasurer. In 1298, Edward returned. He had learned the lesson of the schiltron. He knew that the Scottish spears were impenetrable to cavalry, so he brought the machine gun of the Middle Ages, the longbow. At the Battle of Falkirk, the Scottish spearmen who had stood so tall at Stirling were turned into pincushions by thousands of arrows before the English knights ever touched them. Wallace would spend the next 7 years as a hunted fugitive, eventually meeting a fate so brutal it was designed to be the final word on Scottish resistance. But Edward was wrong. You can kill a guardian, but you cannot kill a precedent. Stirling Bridge remains one of the most lopsided victories in military history. It proved that a professional army is only as strong as its commander's ego. It proved that a narrow bridge can be a more powerful weapon than 1,000 knights. The gilded truth is that Stirling didn't end the war. It started a 700-year struggle for identity. It taught the Scots that they could win, and it taught the world that the gilded armor of an empire could be pierced by the truth of a commoner's spear. The wooden bridge is gone, but the lesson remains. Never underestimate a people who have been pushed into the water. This has been the Gilded Truth.